An hour of UK, Scottish and international news, edited and presented in Scotland to shape the day's news in a way relevant to Scottish audiences. Sounds simple. So why does the proposal for a Scottish 6 o'clock news continue to cause the BBC angst, 17 years after the idea was first floated? Bosses were forced today to confirm they are to run off-air pilots for a Scottish 6 after plans were leaked to the press. But the BBC's own research suggests that viewers are decidedly lukewarm about the idea. Thanks to the magic of TV, Hugh Williams takes us 4 hours back in time.
That's all from the BBC's News at 6, so it's goodbye from me. And on BBC One, we can now join the BBC's news teams where you are.
Goodbye.
Tonight on Reporting Scotland.
Things are different in Scotland and getting more different. But the complaint is that too many stories on BBC One's 6 o'clock news simply don't reflect that.
With devolution and with increasing powers through the years for the Scottish Parliament, more areas of domestic policy are devolved to Scotland, and more stories that appear on the UK news are not relevant here. For example, the junior doctor strike coming up in England. There's obviously not a strike in Scotland here. And that is a problem for the audience when they see something on the main news at 6 o'clock that actually doesn't apply in Scotland.
BBC bosses have appeared before MSPs to answer questions and outline future plans for Scotland.
I want the Director for Scotland to have more power to decide the services that the people of Scotland want for Scotland.
Lord Hall, who's the Director General of the BBC, came to the Scottish Parliament, appeared before the Education and Culture Committee to give evidence, and he himself said that there has to be improvements, there has to be a change to the level and the detail of news and current affairs available here in Scotland. So if Lord Hall, the Director General, recognises that things have to improve, then who might argue with him?
The paper outlining the plan says millions of pounds need to be spent to make BBC Scotland's news good enough to be part of a so-called Scottish 6. Does the new boss think it isn't good enough now to serve the audience?
I think the journalism we produce across all our platforms here is excellent, but there are areas where we could be stronger, and with a bit of investment that we could begin to put some of that right.
So the short answer to that is yes. At the moment, without millions of pounds of investment, your department is shortchanging the audience in Scotland.
I think we produce some very good journalism across all our programmes and the website as well at the moment. But I think it's the case, what we do could always be better in whatever part of news you're looking at. And I would welcome the opportunity for some investment to help us with these issues particularly of relevance.
The union that represents BBC Scotland's journalists agrees.
We've campaigned for years for more staff and resources for news and current affairs in Scotland. In 2014, BBC management never really discussed the detail of how they were going to cover the referendum and all the other major events, and it caused us problems. Staffing levels were insufficient. So at least now they appear to be recognising that there needs to be massive investment, and we welcome the investment, and we certainly welcome the additional jobs. There's some suggestion that the current BBC Scotland staff couldn't handle a Scottish 6 or an extended news. Well, I think they could with the additional resources.
Six Nations match against Italy.
But do the audience actually want a Scottish 6?
I think everybody wants to see a high-quality production from the BBC in Scotland. News and current affairs is part of that package. It's important that we get the highest level of news output in current affairs, not just about Scotland and from Scotland, but reflecting Scotland to the world, but more importantly almost, making sure we cover the UK, cover Europe and world affairs. It cannot be a programme just about Scotland. That's not what anybody wants to see. We want to see a proper programme giving all of the news from the world to Scotland, but produced here in Scotland, high quality jobs, and I think more importantly, showing what BBC Scotland can do.
The BBC says if the plans get the go-ahead, it'll be at least a year before the Scottish 6 goes on air.
Hugh Williams there. Well, joining me now to discuss all this are two former BBC Scotland journalists, the Labour MSP, Ken Macintosh, and in our Dundee studio, the broadcaster, Lesley Riddoch. Good evening to both of you.
Good evening, Shelley.
Ken Macintosh first.
Aye.
The proposal is an hour of UK, Scottish and international news, edited, presented in Scotland to shape the day's news in a way that's relevant to the Scottish audience. What's wrong with that?
Well, on the face of it, nothing. I mean, certainly I welcome the investment that this will mean in facilities and staff here in BBC Scotland, and hopefully in improved output here in Scotland. But it might mean the loss of UK coverage and international and national news. I mean, at the moment we have an hour of Scottish and international and national news. We have the 6 o'clock news, and then we have Reporting Scotland. So I think we can make improvements, but I'm worried that, you know, I don't necessarily need to have my UK news read by somebody with a Scottish accent.
But in the first half hour, there's often a lot of stories in the so-called national network news that are of no relevance to Scotland at all.
Well, there may be occasionally some of less relevance. They're certainly not of no relevance. But, you know, if the main story of the day is, let's say it's David Cameron negotiating in the EU, you know, I'd like to hear Laura Kuenssberg from Westminster telling us what's happening. And I don't want to wait till she's done the national programme and then have our editorial choices become second to theirs. You know, or if it's John Simpson on the refugee crisis, or, you know, Gavin in Washington, whatever it is, I'd like it to be the best person, the main person, giving us the news as it happens, you know, because it's the most important item, not the second choice.
Well, isn't that a fair point, Lesley Riddoch?
I just don't know where Ken's been for the last kind of 20 years, 30 years, 100 years. Because newspapers in Scotland have been blending news, international, national, local news, on a daily basis for, in the Scotsman's case, nearly 200 years. Radio Scotland has been doing this exact job for about 30 to 40 years, and the planet hasn't exploded. You know, nothing has come off its hinges. When Ken's talking about the example of wanting to know what's really going on in Europe and wanting to hear Laura Kuenssberg talking, well, actually, it's quite possible to manage to have that, because that's exactly how radio operates now. There might be a different position in the running order, but there's an even more important point. Laura Kuenssberg might be talking about what's deemed to be the most important thing in Europe from a London perspective, but perhaps at the same time there are fisheries talks going on that really matter. Perhaps there are energy talks going on that really matter to Scotland, which we hear nothing about at the moment because we don't have our own perspective, our own people and our own control over what the news agenda is. And it's not just about a Scot reading the news. That doesn't matter one iota, the nationality of who's reading the news. What matters is the outlook that's developed by the people who are in control of telling Scots what's been important in their lives that day.
So, Ken, this is about relevance. This is what would change with a Scottish Six.
Well, it's not about relevance. Lesley just gave the game away there. It's about controlling the agenda. It's about, you know...
Is it not about reflecting an agenda that matters to Scottish people?
Well, the UK and national agenda matters to the Scottish people. I mean, from what I understand, what we're talking about is this is reflecting the same items, or most of the same items, international news items, so it's, you know, Donald Trump, or it's Syrian refugees or whatever, national news items, so events in Europe and in the UK, across the UK, you know, it could be in Wales and Northern Ireland, because that's, I mean, we still live in the UK. It really matters to me what happens in the rest of the UK. But, you know, these things are already on our news. They're presented. And when Laura Kuenssberg, if I may say, Lesley, when Laura Kuenssberg reads the news, she doesn't do so from a London perspective. She does so with the impartiality and the authoritative voice of the BBC, impartially and objectively.
Ken,
and if you want to replace that with news about energy in Scotland...
She has a few minutes to sum things up. And in a few minutes, some things are in and some things are out. I mean, that's why we have Scottish newspapers. Otherwise, why don't we just read wall to wall the papers that are produced from Fleet Street, Ken?
Well, Lesley Riddoch, there is a bit of a lack of enthusiasm, according to the BBC's own research, from the audience for this idea. I mean, they've expressed concern it would simply be a longer version of Reporting Scotland. Their view was that it was of lower quality than what's produced by the network. Do you think that is a valid concern?
I think there is an issue that if you have always followed what's seen to be the proper news, and there is a tremendous poem actually that James Robertson has performed, 47,000 views I notice on YouTube of it, The News Where You Are, which tries to tackle that very sort of patronising moment where everything that's of real value is then, is ended, and something that is only of sort of local importance begins. Now, if you've been on the receiving end or the production end of that local news, it's very hard to aspire in the kind of way that other small countries or even regions like Catalonia with 11 TV stations, never mind having one solitary bulletin produced from the heart of its capital, or Iceland, a population of 250,000 people with 11 channels. Now that's the kind of ambition that lifts your head and gets the kind of really ambitious, dangerous, perhaps risky, lateral thinking that I would expect to see from people who know they are at the centre of their world, not at the periphery of it.
So Lesley, your ambition for Scotland is to have Icelandic TV instead of the BBC. This is just staggering. This is one of the best news services. It's one of the most trusted news services in the whole world, one of the best broadcasters in the whole world, and you want to give it up for Icelandic TV. I mean, this is just laughable.
No, I don't think so, Ken. Here's what I was saying.
You think this is politically... One moment, Lesley. You think this is politically motivated? That's your suspicion?
Well, there are certainly some who have got political motivations. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. I mean, the thing about this is that we can improve. We can improve the service available to us. We can invest both in BBC Scotland and BBC Current Affairs. But we don't have to give something up. We don't have to give up our national UK coverage to have a more Scottish coverage.
I wonder, Lesley Riddoch, if one of the most striking things to come out of this leaked report is that even the least expensive option, just to enhance the current offering, this saying would require an extra £3.5 million. Well, what does that tell you about what's on offer at the moment?
Well, the risk of sounding like a sort of a kind of hostile guest here, it tells you that a lot of the machinery that's sitting in this Dundee studio hasn't been updated in my entire career, which is 30 years. It tells you that we really are not even trying to get Radio Scotland reflected well within Scotland, because so much of the output is taken from Glasgow studios. I mean, if we're really going to get talking about what it is to produce something for what Ken's party describes as a powerhouse parliament, now that we have the powers of taxation and all sorts of new powers, of course it means that we need to have a kind of broadcasting confidence and an infrastructure and leadership, above all, in management that reflects all of that.
Okay.
So I'd hope that, yes, a lot of the existing staff would have an input into this because, for example, BBC Alba with Yorpa have been producing award-winning programmes for, again, about a decade that tackle the whole of Europe from a particular perspective of just 60,000 Gaelic speakers. How much more exciting would it be if Scots as a whole were having that kind of focus?
I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, both of you. Thank you very much, Lesley Riddoch, Ken Macintosh.